Hello, everybody. Welcome to this this fall edition of Adult Science Fiction Fantasy Debut Panels. I think that the names, I don't honestly, every time I have to come up with a name for a panel, I'm in even more awe of authors and having to come up with names and plots and stories. I can't even. So the panel names are getting a little bit more unhinged as the year goes on. But I'm so excited to be chatting with some of my most anticipated reads of 2024. If you don't know who I am, my name is Lily. I'm the moderator for the panel, and I'm kind of the live face behind Utopia State of Mind. So now we're going to have our authors introduce themselves, tell us about their books, and then we're going to dive into some questions that I had when I read the books. If you have any questions during the panel or maybe at the end, put them in the live chat, which you should be able to find somewhere on the YouTube page, and I will make sure to go back to them at the end or during the panel, depending on the question. And so, let's start with intros. PH, do you want to start?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Phoebe Lowe, writing as PH Lowe. My book, These Selfish Shores, is out now from Orbit in the US and Angry Robot in the UK. It's a gender-bent Captain Hook origin story, kind of flavored by Southeast Asia, in which a former lost boy, who is actually a girl, kind of grows up and but still has this addiction to the magic dust of her childhood, and she returns to the. Did I just block out? To sort of reclaim her magic and her story, and yeah, that's pretty much her book.
Hi, I'm Emmett North. My debut novel is In Universes, which has two cool covers. I just got the UK version, so I'm really hyped about it. It is the best way I've been able to summarize it is a genderqueer awakening fractured across the multiverse. It follows the narrator and a constellation of their closest friends and lovers across parallel universes, some of which are pretty realist and some of which are extremely strange. There are alien infested bears and people fracturing into hordes of animals, but then there's also physics labs being hard and things like that. But yeah, just sort of asking these questions of how do you figure out who you really are and who you want to be versus what the world has wanted you to be.
Hi, I'm Jen, and my novel is Foul Days. I'm not as prepared as Emmett. It's up there, but I can show you the cover later. So it's a Bulgarian folklore-inspired secondary world fantasy about a witch who trades her magic away to escape her monster-infested city and her monstrous, abusive ex-partner. And she finds herself on the other side of a magical wall, which is inspired by the Berlin Wall. And once there, she realizes that, firstly, witches who have no magic soon perish, and secondly, her horrible ex is not that easy to shake off, and he's still following her.
Hi, I'm Corin, writing this KM Enright, and my debut romantasy, Mistress of Lies, is out now from Orbit. Mistress of Lies is a queer dark romantasy that follows a blood mage spy master as she recruits a noble bastard with a terrible gift to hunt down a magical serial killer for the eternal vampiric king, all while planning to overthrow him.
Perfect. I'm fine. I'm glad to hear the final quick synopsis of In Universes, because when I could not conceptualize how to make a synopsis without spoiling anything, and I was like, it's about multiple timelines, and that's about that's about all I can tell people. So I want to start off with probably the question that you all have gotten the most, which is basically the process of debut, from conceptualization of the novel to its release, and especially since all of your books are out in the world, what has surprised you about release as well? PH, do you want to start?
Sure. I was curious what other people would say. I was like trying to hold back. Yeah. So yeah, my process from conceptualization, it's been like 7 years. I started this book or a version of this book as a NaNoWriMo project in 2017, and it started off as like YA sci-fi. So it's been a really messy like I revised it 8 times before it was acquired, and like there were like premise changes, there were like major secondary character changes, there were like multiple times where 2/3 of the way mark to like 25% mark. So it was just like chaos everywhere. And yeah, so yeah, I think it was just like this was my first like adult fantasy. Like I'd written a previous novel that had gone on submission, but this was really like kind of trying where I was like trying most things. I had like 4 points of view. Just like a lot of learning occurred over the process of drafting this novel, and yeah, like further learning when I was like going through edits, and I was like, oh, this is like how to make things more clear and like how to have an actual like ending and things like that. So yeah, it's definitely been a really interesting learning process. And then in terms of release, I think it was interesting because I've seen like I worked in publishing, retweeting like agency authors milestones and things like that. So it was really interesting because like I kind of thought that like so much of the like the feelings around like being published would come from those like milestones and sort of like, you know, I got this review or whatever. But I think for me, like what really like made it real was sort of like the in-person events and sort of like talking to real people. And like I had one launch event at You and Me Books in New York, and I'd lived there for a while. So it was just really nice, like seeing my friends again, and also like meeting people who had heard about me from social media and being like, oh my gosh, like I'm like, I got asked a question about like how to query, and I just got like full body chills. They're like, oh, I'm like the person that people are asking now. So that I think that was like a really unique and yeah, like kind of the more like soul filling part of this process. So yeah, it's been an interesting ride.
It was also exactly the same timeline for me. Like I also started this, and maybe a tiny bit at the end of 2016, but mostly starting in 2017. So right about 7 years. So perfect amount of time to write to write a book, I think. Look forward to having another book 7 years from now. But yeah, I started this as separate short stories. And so I spent a lot of those years working on this as a story collection, and it wasn't until like 4 years into the process, I think, that I had this thought of like, wait a minute, all of these characters are actually versions of the same character and really versions of myself in certain ways. And once I had that thought, like versions of myself, my background was in physics, and I had written my undergrad thesis on the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. And so when I thought like versions, I was like, oh my gosh, this is actually a multiverse story. Like this has to be a multiverse story. And then it took me like the next 3 years to rewrite the whole thing like a dozen times to try to make it cohere. And so yeah, it's definitely been like, on the one hand, I think the sort of heart of the book has stayed really similar across the whole time period, but on the other hand, the like logistics of it have definitely shifted a lot. The thing that I would say sort of similarly also to Phoebe, like the most surprising thing about release has just been how incredible it feels to see people connect with the book. I think I had sort of hadn't let myself imagine that, even though that's like obviously the sort of the coolest thing about being a writer, but mostly I've been so focused on the book and the craft and trying to make it the best book it could be, and not really let myself think about like, oh, what's it going to feel like to have people find themselves in it. And so getting to hear from readers has been just like phenomenally cool. Like it makes me feel so emotional every time. it makes me feel like, oh yeah, actually, like, even if like none of the things that I dreamt, like I think my dreams for the book were often sort of like, oh, I hope that it gets like XYZ, sort of what people are saying also, like this sort of like critical milestone. And now I'm like, well, actually, even if none of those things happen, just to get to hear from people who are like loving it and seeing themselves in it, I sort of feel like that's enough. And I'm surprised by that that feeling, even though it's a good thing.
Well, I started my book in 2018, so I think we have a bit of a theme here. So yeah, it took me 6 years, and it was just the same as what you were saying. It was rewriting, writing again, changing it. I went through a mentorship program where I rewrote 2/3 of it. The only thing that remained the same was the beginning and the ending. Everything in the middle got completely rewritten. So it's been a very long process to get to the final draft. But yeah, I also found, so I've had a lot of time to overthink everything and get really nervous about like what happens when the book is finally out. And what I found was surprising was the fact that when it was finally out, it kind of felt like a weight off my shoulders. It felt like it's out in the world now. It doesn't have anything to do with me anymore. It's for the readers. And similarly, to what you two are saying, I also had focused a lot on like critical reception and or what would Kirkus say, or what will I don't even think like what if that I don't get any positive reviews and things like that. But it turns out once the book is out there with readers, it's so cool to get people who get it, like to realize that the book has found its readers. And it turns out a lot of these like more official milestones don't really matter anymore as long as you have people who care about the book and who get it and who love it.
So I also had a long journey. I first started working on this book in 2016, so I'm right around there with the rest of you. But my journey had a lot of stops and starts. We went out on submission with this book in 2020, right as the pandemic hit. So I was on submission for almost 2 years. So that was just a long break away from this world and this book, and then you get pulled back into it. And from there, it was also like a long breath between, when we first got the book acquired to when the book came out. So it was a lot of stops and starts and having to go back to revisit this world. And what's been most interesting for me and surprising about now that the book's out is it's a good book, but it's also a time capsule of who I used to be because I worked on it for so long that I also have to like look back at it and I'm like, wow, this is a good book. But I know that my writing is a little different now than it was 5 years ago, 8 years ago. So it's just kind of accepting how as you continue on in this world, in this career, you're constantly moving past the books you put out, but there's still a reflection of this journey that you've been on.
I love that so much. I've also never really heard that, but it makes so much sense in the idea of like it being so much of a product of a specific moment and a specific journey. And then knowing that like your craft and your skills will obviously improve the more you just do it, I guess, for lack of a better word. Um, I would love to know from all of you what kind of draws you in general, though, to the speculative fiction genre, and also sort of what have been some formative speculative fiction works for you in your life. Emmett, do you want to start?
Sure. There's a quote that I read from Maria Machado in an interview a while back where she talked about how the experience of like moving through the world as a queer AFAB person is often one of like having your reality treated as unreal. And I think that's particularly true as a trans or genderqueer person. And so I think to me, there's something about speculative fiction that allows me to better approach the sort of like truth of my experience in the world. So even though I am writing speculative stuff, often it's a way to get towards reality in a way that I can't figure out how to do without these speculative elements. And I think yeah, I mean, Carmen Machado, obviously an influence. Also, Kelly Link was like some of the first really weird speculative fiction that I read, and I was like, oh my God, you can do this? Cool. Also, this writer Abby May Otis, who wrote a book called Alien Virus Love Disaster, that's so amazing and weird, and everybody should read it. It's really cool. It's a Small Beer Press. Also, for like multiverse stuff, Micaiah Johnson wrote this like incredible multiverse book called The Space Between Worlds, and just released a sequel, sort of sequel to it this year called Those Beyond the Wall. And these books are phenomenal. They're so good. I'm like, everyone needs to read them. They should be required reading. Yeah.
I can also answer with a quote by someone else who is smarter than me. So what attracts me to speculative fiction is, I think it was Terry Pratchett who said that speculative fiction is like a distorted mirror of our reality. So it's kind of similar to Emmett's approach. I love how you can take an idea and in speculative fiction that's obviously removed from our real world and use it to explore issues and problems that we deal with in the real world. And so Terry Pratchett is one of my big influences. And also authors like T. Kingfisher and V. Schwab, and authors who don't have any qualms about exploring very serious problems through the lens of humor and fun and adventure. That's what I try to do with my books. And I also have quite a bit of Eastern European influences, like the Strugatsky brothers and other Soviet time authors who also used both speculative fiction and humor as a way to escape censorship and a way to sneak past the communist government certain ideas that wouldn't be necessarily acceptable in a realistic fiction novel.
While I don't disagree with what's been said before, I do love to use speculative fiction as a way to explore parallels to things that are going on in the world and real life issues. For me, there's also just the very basic tenet of it's fun. If I wanted to deal with computers and meetings and punching in a time clock, I just have a regular job. So for me, I love the speculative fiction because it's so different from our reality and we're allowed to play with things that could literally never happen. Like, as much as I wish them to be real, vampires are not real. So that's why I'm drawn to this genre over the others. Um, for me, some real formative stuff has definitely been like the works of Anne Rice. Like, I definitely love when we get to blend the speculative and the erotic and the romantic. That's definitely something I do a lot in my work, and I especially love exploring as a queer writer. I love to take these people and put them in like messy situations and have fun. I also love a lot of writers like V. Schwab was already mentioned. S.T. Gibson is an author that I really love who's doing some great work right now. And there's a lot of really fun stuff also happening in the queer indie scene. So I just kind of try and read all over the place and take my inspiration as it comes.
Cool. Yeah, just echoing all the smart things that everyone else has said about speculative fiction. Yeah, I definitely enjoy it because of sort of like the fun potential, as well as the ability to sort of like, you know, tell these truths in ways that are sort of floating a little bit above, you know, real life, and kind of even kind of like abstracting them in a way that makes them hit harder, because, you know, we don't have preconceptions about like whatever issue is being discussed. I think, yeah, just like growing up as a kid, I just always thought like speculative fiction or like fantasy was like what books were for in a way. Like I read because there was an opportunity to like escape into another world and sort of like experience these different things and like have these adventures. And I think like that hasn't changed, and I don't think like it should change. I have a lot of thoughts from doing an MFA, like sort of there's some discourse around like, oh, you know, when you grow up, you know, you should kind of, you know, go into more like realism, and like this is like the advanced thing. But I think for me it's been, you know, like there is I think speculative fiction available to like people of all age groups and like all reading levels and sort of like levels of or desired complexity, and I think it's definitely like there is something for everyone. And I guess in terms of formative works, like so many people mentioned B. Schwab, like in Shades of Magic, like the way that sentences are structured, like taught me how to write. So I think it was definitely a big influence for me. Also, the Darker Shade of Magic, or like the Shades of Magic series specifically, I think showed me like along the lines of like the fun that we've discussed, that, you know, like even in adult fantasy, like you can just make up stuff because it's cool and because you are writing fiction. And you don't have to have like a PhD in like the cultural history of like whatever, you know, societies or, you know, things that you've been influenced by. Like you can tell a good story without, you know, having to kind of like, you know, spend 20 years of your life making sure that everything is accurate, because again, you're writing fiction. And then kind of on the other side of that, Greenbone Saga was a big influence on me, especially for these Delta Shores. I've actually written a whole thing about it, and it's in Reactor magazine if you just like Google like PH Low, Greenbone Saga, etc. And just the main thing being that like there are a lot of kind of like weird cultural things that my parents did. They're from Malaysia, and growing up in predominantly white like Iowa, it was always just like oh my god, like why are you doing that? And sort of not being able to parse like the like narrative logic behind those things. And Greenwood Saga sort of like took this, you know, like a lot of Asian culture and like moral things and made them into these like huge epic, you know, story arcs and like characters. And it was just like something like clicked in my brain when I read it, and I thought that was really cool. And then also like it does obviously like an amazing job with like all the politics and the world building and just like everything. So if you haven't read that series, I highly recommend. And then finally, I have to pitch This Is How You Lose the Time War because I've read it like 10 times. And it's just like the prose, the plot, like the way everything ties together is just like is perfect. I've pushed it on my whole like MFA cohort. Like I just like hand out copies, like, have you heard? so yeah, it's definitely a big influence on my prose as well.
Yeah, I can definitely second Greenbone Saga 100%. If anyone has any questions as well, please drop them in the chat. I've seen some questions already, but if you have any more, I'm going to pivot to some questions that are talking about books specifically. So I want to talk about Mistress of Lies and Foul Days, which are both the first or the book ones in the series. And so I'd love to know, working on the next book where you don't have 6 or 7 years for the second book, how that process has been, and if your vision of the second book has changed or was changed by your experience writing the first, and specifically for Foul Days, because of the quick turnaround, how that works, like how it happens, basically.
So for Foul Days, it was actually not that quick a turnaround on my end, because it looks really quick to readers because books come out like 4 months between each other. But for me, I got the offer for the book at the end of 2021, and the book didn't come out until 2024. And the reason we did that was specifically so I have more time to work on the sequel, which I really appreciated because I've never written a sequel before. And it turns out when people tell you, yeah, sequels are terrible to write, so difficult, they're right. They're not just joking. But so you have this first book that is a complete and edited product, and then you have to go back to like a first draft of a second book, and in comparison it looks so much worse, like a first draft of a second book compared to the finished product of the first one. So that's one thing that you kind of have to get your mind around. And then there's also the fact that obviously you want your second book to be different than the first. You don't want to retell the same story, but you want it to appeal to the same audience. Like people who like the first book will want to read the second. People who didn't like the first book will not read the second one anyway. So you want to be kind of different but the same, which is really hard. So yeah, but so far I've complained a lot, but I also have to say it didn't take me 6 years to write the second book. It took me actually 4 months to draft the first draft and then a couple of months to edit it. And that was because I knew the world so well and I knew my characters so well at this point. It was actually the easy part was jumping back into this world and already knowing exactly how each character will react to each situation, already having all the different relationships established, and obviously just getting to play more with certain relationships, deepen them a bit rather than having to establish them from the start. So that was my experience. I'm very curious to hear how Corin found it.
So I actually really enjoyed writing my sequel for a lot of the reasons Jen brought up here. I already know this world. I already know these characters, so in some ways it's a lot easier than drafting a first draft of a new project because you're not like, oh shit, how does this magic system work again? You already know it. And that really allowed me to get like deeper into twisting the magic system and showing new facets of it, as well as with the characters. Since I established who they are in the first book, I'm able to take them and twist them in new ways as like a response to what they've already been through, and how they respond to that can lead to some really juicy character moments. I do think that, I am a different writer writing book 2 than I was writing book 1. I do think book 2 is even darker and even sexier, and I think that's part of my evolution as a creative. So I'm very excited to see how book 2 is going to land with readers, because I feel like it's a lot of, okay, if you liked what's in Mistress, yes, but more.
For both of you, when you sold the book, or like when you had that, was it already sold as like the series, or did you have to sort of tweak that a little?
This was always my series was always envisioned as a trilogy, and I was lucky that Orbit bought into that from the beginning. So it's always been like there's 3 books in this saga, and that has not changed since the beginning.
For me, it was not. I quit it as a standalone, and I had heard that that's like best practice, best advice, and I'm a big rule follower. So I was like, right, okay, I'm going to do it exactly how people tell me. And then we had a call with my editor before she offered, and she said, have you ever thought about writing a sequel? And I was like, no, but I am listening. So she was like, yeah, and so these characters that you've written have really complex past. They are overcoming a lot of trauma. So I feel like you need to explore their relationships in a second book. So you kind of, she pretty much felt that the emotional arc in book 1 leads quite nicely into an emotional arc for book 2. And she also felt like there's more to explore in the world, which I obviously agreed with because I love the world of Foul Days and I loved returning to it. So that kind of worked out well for me because obviously it's better to sell 2 books rather than sell 1 book, but also because I felt like it worked really well for the story and I am quite happy with how the sequel shaped up.
So these Deathless Shores is our telling, as you mentioned, of Peter Pan. And I would love to know from you if you could talk about the process was in terms of a retelling or a reimagining, in terms of what aspects you kind of knew you wanted to change or knew you wanted to keep, and what sort of challenges there are to approaching, retelling in the sense that there are sort of characters and adaptations that are in people's minds going into like Peter Pan, right? Everyone has their idea of Peter Pan. And then how do you approach that?
Yeah, so premise of these Deathless Shores sort of crystallized for me after I read the original, and I was like, wow, this is really sexist and racist. And like, yeah, so there was that, and like immediately I kind of had an idea of like, okay, we're not going to put in the weird stuff about the Native Americans, and also wanting to like explore the way that gender and I was also struck by the way that childhood is portrayed. Like if anyone's like read the book or watched the movie, you know that like childhood is this sort of like glorified, pure, like magical, innocent state, and that when people lose it, it's like this huge tragedy. And in the original, there's this line that like when the Lost Boys grow up, they're like Peter thins them out. I was like, oh, wow, okay. That was, I do not remember that in the Disney movie. We're going to do something with that because that's kind of horrifying. So yeah, that was definitely an element I wanted to include. And then also just thinking about childhood more broadly, I think what ended up happening was that the questions that these Stuff the Shores asks are sort of toward, like what happens if your childhood is not that like, straight, white, abled, like ideal, and you're queer, you're like BIPOC or neurodivergent, or like you have some other like disability, and I think like for kids in those like circumstances, it's like there's like a certain like shame or like other issues that you carry, like even as a child, like it's not this sort of like weightless innocent thing. And then when you grow up, it's suddenly like according to this narrative, like suddenly you're the villain. And so it's sort of like when do you get to be the protagonist? Like when do you actually deserve magic? And so like that was something I definitely wanted to explore from the outset. And yeah, so Jordan is this sort of like I always envisioned her as someone who had like aged out of the island, and like she gets her period, which is how she's discovered as a lost boy, and is kicked out, and sort of like wanting to go back and like having this conflicted relationship with this place because like she was never really welcome, and yet it is sort of like the closest that she got to come to magic within her childhood. And then I guess some other aspects, characters coming from Britain, they're from like a sort of like Malaysia or like Southeast Asia inspired country, and honestly, like my thought was just like, why not? Because there's been so much, in fantasy where like white authors would be like, hey, let's make this like an Asian aesthetic, and like done no research whatsoever, or like they went to like for 2 weeks once and like thought it was cool. So I was like, what's stopping me? And then also like the fact that Malaysia, it's like where my parents are from, is like a former colony of Britain, was something that I found interesting as well. Like when my dad was also like a bookstore kid, so like in Malaysia he would go to these bookstores with his lunch money, and he would see all these like like Hans Christian Andersen or like the Brothers Grimm or these like European kind of like exports, right? And so I thought it would be interesting culture, but like these characters who are still like extremely influenced by it. So yeah, that was kind of like the thought behind the setting. And in terms of challenges, I think there were just a lot of different elements of the original that I thought I could play with. So for example, like the crocodile had a bigger role in previous drafts, but like just didn't end up working its way in with sort of like the character arcs and things that I wanted to focus on.
Yeah, I love what you kind of talked about a little bit earlier when you talked about childhood, because I feel like that was one of the most, I like read one of, I don't remember obviously the exact line, but like read it and I had to stop for a little bit. And I think it was when you were talking about change and how it's like this necessary force within life and how the island like suspends that, right? And it's almost like you never can you never change, and how it seems like this weird Twilight Zone thing, whereas I feel like in the adaptations that you might see with cartoon characters, it's not as like dark.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely.
Now I want to ask a little bit, Emmett, you kind of talked a little about this earlier, and I want to delve into it a little bit more, but about the approach of the theme of self across multiverses. And specifically what I loved as well is like the ways that you're able to chat about the things that stay the same and the things that are different. And so I just want to hear all about how you approach that theme across these parallel-ish worlds.
Yeah, I think because I started with these individual chapters as like standalones, I think when I started to consider the whole thing together, it was really interesting to attend to what stayed the same and what varied. And I think so much of there's this quote by this activist Alexander Leon that I really love, which is like, queer people don't grow up as ourselves. We grow up playing a version of ourselves that sacrifices authenticity to minimize humiliation and prejudice. The massive task of our adult lives is to unpick which parts of ourselves are truly us and which parts we've created to protect us. And when I read that the first time, I was just like, oh my God, because I do think that there's this sense of like, well, you just have to be yourself. And it's like, well, who is that? Like, what part of me is that? You ask yourself, like in the opening of my novel, the narrator, Rafi, really wants to be a physicist, which is drawn from my own life. And I wanted so badly to be a physicist when I was young. And that was like my desire. Like, it wasn't like anybody else told me to do that. But later I was like, well, like, where did that desire come from? Like, why did I want that? And I think that the answer to that question had a lot more to do with like how we perceive physics and its connection with like genius and masculinity and all of these things that were more about how I wanted to be perceived than what I actually wanted for myself. And so I think in universes, I wanted to show the narrator sort of grappling with what is really them, what brings them joy, what actually makes them feel like themselves, and what is like something that they are trying to be because they think that that's the shape they have to fit themselves in order to belong, in order to be loved, in order to like have some sort of a life in the world. And so, yeah, it was really interesting to me to sort of like try to puzzle together like what pieces are staying the same, what pieces are shifting, and like how to sort of do that intentionally without having it be really like linear, because like I don't know, my like journey towards like self-awareness and towards queerness was very non-linear. Like, it wasn't like, okay, I've always known this and I just need to like start working. It was like, oh yeah, sort of like this like sideways non-linear journey. And so trying to do that in the book, it meant that organizing the chapters was a total nightmare. I had all of these different pieces and I was like, I have this sense that there is like one order they have to go in, but I don't know what it is. And I kept hoping that like sooner or later in the editing process, someone would tell me what it was. Like, I was like, maybe my agents know, maybe my editor knows. Someone's gonna come along and tell me how this should work. And then like nobody was doing it, which was very disappointing that I had to order my own book. But I ended up eventually, like sort of very late in the process, coming up with like a set of rules for myself that I think also helped me think through like what parts of Rafi's self were shifting and what parts were staying the same. And so the book is split into 3 sections. And in the first section, each chapter ends with Rafi making a sort of like outwards facing wish. So like the first chapter, they are working in this physics lab and they're like really obsessed with this queer sculptor for reasons they like won't acknowledge to themselves. And they end the chapter by like wishing that there was a universe where like they had met the sculptor when they were younger. And so then the next chapter, we're in that universe. And so each of those wishes is sort of like, I wish something was different about the world. And then in the second section of the book, each chapter ends with an inwards facing wish. So I wish that I were different in some way. I would, like the narrator's like, I wish I was the sort of person who wasn't so like afraid of change. I wish that I was better capable of like handling like my fears of loss, like these sort of inwards facing wishes. And then like the final chapter is like this place of sort of radical acceptance of like, I am like happy with what or like not even necessarily happy, but like, here's where I am and I'm going to like live here in this place in this moment. And so I think through that like process of like what do you wish to be different about the world? What do you wish to be different about yourself? What does stay the same across all of those? It was sort of this way of asking the question of like, how do we figure out what parts of ourselves are like the truest parts and what parts are like enforced upon us for reasons that we may or may not be able to recognize in any given moment.
Just based on hearing about you having to kind of put together this book and everything, are you a plotter? Is that like plotter versus pantser? Because I feel like I don't know how someone who would just kind of sit down and like without any plan go about creating a multiverse with those kinds of different kind of worlds and questions.
Yeah, I mean, I think a little bit of both. I'm just like constantly quoting other writers, but there's a writer who was like, you have to trust the metaphor knows more than you do. And I think I believe in like the writing, like knowing things that I don't know, and I want to follow that. Like I think that if I try to control things too tightly, I get to less interesting places than I do if I like let the writing do what it wants. I was thinking about this, Phoebe, when you're talking about like how like you don't necessarily need to justify putting in the elements that you think are interesting. I also did an MFA, and I feel like that's very much like, why are there aliens in this chapter? I'm like, there are aliens because I want there to be aliens, right? But it's like I do trust that like if my brain is putting something in there for some reason, like it should be there, it belongs. And so I think there are parts of it where it felt very much like I was just letting the book do what it wanted to do. I was following it where it wanted to go. And then I think when it came to like the overall structure, then it was very sort of plotty, but it's like the individual pieces already existed. So it was this sort of like weird, this weird bit of plotting. But I did have like, oh my gosh, I had just absolutely bananas looking like diagrams and flow charts and like Excel sheets. I sort of drove myself a little bit crazy in the editing process as I tried to sort of impose logic upon things.
Yeah, I definitely just imagine like one of those string boards in your house being like, where does everything go?
100%. Yeah. And there's so many, like, somebody was like writing to me and they were like, oh yeah, I think that like there are like there's so many connections that I like want to like track down. And I was like, yeah, like if you are the sort of person that like likes to find Easter eggs, like there are so many, like I put in so many connections between things and like echoing lines and echoing motifs and whatever. And so many of them I was like, nobody is ever going to notice this except for me, but it brings me joy.
I want to pivot to some questions that we've gotten already from the audience. If you have any questions as well, this is your golden opportunity to add more to our chat box. An earlier question we got, which I really liked, was the question, what was your favorite chapter to write? So maybe like one, I mean, obviously everyone is like able to do whatever they want, but obviously maybe not like a super spoilery one, I guess.
Mine is, I'll keep it short, but yeah, mine is a big spoiler. But basically, like the reason it's my favorite is because I got to quote ton of French, and it's in I have a little like appendix like citation thing in the back, but yeah, it like worked in the context. I was like, oh, this is like I love Easter eggs. It was fun, but yeah, big spoiler.
My favorite, I think, is the last chapter. I think mostly because of what Corin said, which is that I started this book so long ago, and so much of this is like past self, and the final section slash chapter, which is quite long, is the newest part of the book, and so it's like the only part that feels sort of like still fresh to me. Like I haven't actually read it through 17 million times. I've only read it through like 4 million times, which makes it feel sort of exciting to me. It's also just a sort of fun question to be like, what does it take to reach, like any multiverse story, you have to eventually stop moving. Sort of like the problem of a multiverse story is like it's infinite. So how do you stop? And so being like, okay, like what is it that like makes this character stop moving, stop shifting? What is it that makes the book stop shifting? I think was a really fun question to try to answer.
I have several, but I'm going to go for the least spoilery one. So there is a chapter where our characters have to go and ask for a favor from a group of monsters. from Bulgarian folklore called the Samudivas, and they are my absolute favorite because they are these forest spirits that love music, and they are known to like trap and kidnap and trap musicians and force them to play music for them until they die from exhaustion. They're really monstrous and they turn up in a lot of folkloric tales, and I really like them because they're also very feminine, and I'm also always really attracted to that kind of feminine monstrous elements of folklore. So our characters meet them and they dance with them, and the character who dances with them is not enchanted, which is highly unusual, and then we kind of have to figure out why.
Gonna try and talk about this without spoilers, but my favorite chapter is actually the epilogue, because that's when we introduce a new point of view that I was very, very excited to get to. And I loved writing that point of view, and I get to do it more in the sequel. And yeah, like I love Sean and I love Sam, but I have my favorites. And when you get to the epilogue, you'll find out who that is.
I love that. Another question we got was, did your favorite part of the writing process change throughout the? Oh wait, hold on. I read that completely wrong. Did your favorite parts change throughout the process of editing and then publication?
I can answer that because yes. So my favorite part, I always prefer revising to begin with over drafting. So I have a scene that when I was first drafting it, I didn't have a very clear idea where I'm going with it. And then when I went back to revise it, I could add some fun little elements that I'd completely. Obviously, they were somewhere in the back of my subconscious when I was writing it because they were already there and I could play with them. But revising it let me bring them forward, and I really enjoyed it's essentially the moment in the story where the main character rediscovers her strength and her power and defeats temporarily, since it's the first part of a duology, temporarily manages to banish some of the ghosts from her past.
Yeah, I guess I would say that like the core of the characters stayed the same throughout. Like I think once I found them, they kind of stayed the same through revisions. As I mentioned, there was a lot of like moving up the 2/3 of the way to like the 25% mark. So like the actual lines, definitely in like situations and like even time. But I think like Jordan's vibes, for example, like the sort of like thinking first with her fists, like no thoughts had empty, and also Baron, who's the main love interest and just has anxiety and is like, why do I have to capitalism? I think that kind of stayed pretty similar throughout. Like, kind of like once I had kind of figured out how to write them, or like their voices, I think stayed the same throughout. And I also, yeah, I do think that they're like the actual, like what was my favorite changed over time. So I think like writing Jordan was like kind of my favorite part of like the early, like the first few years. And then I think like the pandemic hit, it was just like brain things, like not like wanting to kind of like engage in conflict, and then it kind of like switched to Baron. So I had a great time like writing both characters, but like kind of at different times. So it's interesting.
You guys keep hitting me with the questions that are just like, well, spoiler. So, Sean, I loved writing Sean. She was my favorite to get from the get-go. She's so cunning, but also so stupid, emotionally speaking. She's emotionally stunted, and she denies it. So she was really fun to write. And initially, she was my favorite character, but through edits, and also like as I grappled with where this story is going in future installments, my favorite shifted again to that epilogue POV character, and especially how their point of view and Sean's kind of both mesh and clash in different ways. And I love playing with that more as we got into revisions and planning out what a sequel would look like. Which is a very vague answer because there are so many spoilers in the last third of this book, but
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, they're like, because each universe is sort of different, I have like sort of definitely some favorite universes that I think have stayed the same. Like there's a universe where people are fracturing into hordes of animals when they give birth to daughters, which has been in the book since that's one of the very first chapters that I wrote back in 2017. And there's also a world where these like extraterrestrial microbes have come to Earth, and then they're like in the water, and the animals drink the water and then like become murderous and are like killing off all of the humans. And so both of those were really fun. There's also a chapter with a bunch of ghost bears, and I loved the ghost bears. People kept being like, "Do you need this many bears?" And I was like, "Absolutely, I cannot have one fewer bear. They are all mandatory." Um, yeah, so I think that those sort of like universes stayed my favorites, or like stayed some of my favorites throughout. But I think whatever was sort of newest was usually what I was like the most excited about. Um, because I'm like a really, really iterative editor. So like, the chapter with the hordes of animal, like with the people fracturing, I have like 54 drafts of it on my computer. And so by the end, I'm just like, I'm so sick of this. Please don't make me read it again. Not that anyone was making me read it the first 54 times, um but it is interesting too. I think going back, like many of the sentence on a sentence level, things will stay like from the beginning to the end. So if there's like a sentence that I love, usually I keep loving it.
I want to ask about titles, since, as I've mentioned before, is like the worst part of making a panel is trying to figure out what something is called. I literally have sometimes emailed people and be like, "What do you want me to call this?" So I want to know from you all if there's a story behind your title, if you're as bad as titles with titles as me, and has it always been titled that? From draft one to release day, essentially.
I could go. Yeah, so Beast of the Shores, it's kind of based on some of the lines in the original Peter Pan. There's sort of like on these magic shores, children at play are forever beaching their coracles. We have been there. We can still hear the sound of the surf, though we shall land no more. And sort of like thinking about the shore as this like border, like liminal space between the childhood magic and the everything else that comes with adulthood. But there's a short story by Cassandra Kaw called These Deathless Bones, and it's also like a villain. And I just I was like, oh my god, this is so cool. And then Catherine Valente wrote a book called Deathless, which is also a retelling. And so I feel like I just like kind of mashed those things together and was like, this is fine, right? And a previous title was Blood and Dust and Memory. I was told it was kind of like leaning YA, and I guess it's sort of like a little like sometimes just like the like words without connections can be like, I don't know, whatever. So I changed it, and it's been Beast Off the Shore since then.
These Deathless Shores is such a good title. Mine was originally, the first chapter of the book is called Deformation Catalog. And so for a while I was calling it that, but I sort of knew it wasn't gonna stick because it's really hard. Like, I'm like, is it deformation or deformation? And then people would call it defamation. And I was like, I think this is gonna be a problem long term. But I mean, it made sense because I was like, oh, it's a catalog of things deforming. So I had it as that. And then it was my agents were like, one of my agents was like, what if we call it Deformation Catalog, a novel in universes? which I thought was cool. And then my other agent was like, what if we just call it In Universes? And I was like, great, love it. Makes me think of Radiohead and Rainbow, which is pretty cool. I'm into it. And so then it just stayed that. So in that case, although they would not order the book for me, they did just title the book for me, and I was like, love it. Thanks so much, guys. Your commission.
For me, it was kind of an obvious title because the book takes part during the Fowl Days, which is 12 days in Bulgarian folklore between Christmas and St. Jordan's Day, when the new year has been born, but it hasn't been baptized yet. So all sorts of terrible monsters and spirits and ghosts can roam the lands and terrorize the population. So I'm famously bad at titles. So I was like, as I was drafting the book, I was like, I'll just call it Fowl Days and then we'll figure something out else later. And I was kind of relying on my agent and my editor to suggest a new title. And then we were getting closer and closer to publication. A new title was never suggested. And I was like, is someone going to come up with some really cool and clever title for me? So at one point I asked, I was like, are you sure you want to just keep it Foul Days? They were like, yeah, it's great. It's like short and punchy. It can fit on the cover really beautifully. And I was like, I have accidentally stumbled into a title that actually works brilliant. For once, this actually happened.
I don't really have an exciting story for how I came up with the title. I was in the car with my husband. We were driving to a family event, and it was just like Mistress of Lies. That's Sean. So it's not a fun story. Before that, I did have a working title that I don't love, but it was Bastards and Broken Things because it felt like really on the nose. Samuel's the bastard, Sean's the broken thing. Like it works, not great, but then Mistress of Lies, just there.
I have small follow-up questions. Jen, did you also come up with the second book title? Was it a similar process?
It was actually. So for the second title, I again was like, well, we have days, we should have nights. So I was like, oh, adjective for nights, go. And we had hundreds. And then I think at the start, I was like, oh, Monstrous Nights, that sounds quite good. And I titled that the first draft. And I sent it to my editor, but the name of the series is The Witch's Compendium of Monsters. So I was kind of like, am I repeating the same pattern? So for a bit, we kind of tried to come up with other adjectives to go before nights. But the issue with the word nights is that a lot of adjectives that you add to it start sounding kind of dirty. So it's like everything we added, I was like, that sounds like an erotica. And we kept going. And then eventually went back to Monstrous Nights, which I was like, why did we just spend so long trying to come up with something new when this worked from the start?
Cam, did you come up with the name of the series, or did who came up with the name of the series? Because it's not the same, right? It's a different arching trilogy name.
So I came up with that, but it was also basically like, hey, what's the name of the series? And I'm just like, oh, I need that. So I'm just like, Age of Blood. And they're like, that's great. And I'm like, cool. Never talked about it again.
Love that. Yeah, it's hard to I feel like sometimes you see series where it's like a completely different name, and then sometimes you just see it's like Mistress of Lies 1, Mistress of Lies 2, which doesn't necessarily work so much when it's multiple books and it's like not the same title anymore. Thank you so much to everyone who joined. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions. And of course, thank you to the panelists for discussing all of their lovely books. I've put everyone's link to the book in the description box below this YouTube video. So definitely go there and check it out because you can get all of them today. They're all out. They're all purchasable. So you can get all of them today and you can always add them to your TBR and get them out from your library as well. And I hope everyone has a really great rest of your day and rest of your reading year as well. Bye, everybody.
Thanks for having us. Bye-bye.